Okay, I think we'll just start the webinar, everybody. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar when we're going to be looking at the topic of positive health and well-being and what the science tells us about that. And I'm going to introduce you in a moment to our speaker today, Professor Ciaran O'Boyle. Just a few little housekeeping things before we start off, just to say that while you're on the webinar, that you will be automatically muted, and you will remain muted throughout the webinar. And please do engage in chat through the chat box if you have questions or comments, and just let us know where you're attending from today. So that would be really, really helpful. Just to say that this session is being recorded today as well. And when you join the webinar, you can listen to the webinar over the computer, but sound quality can be better over the phone if you wish to dial in, and the dial number will be put into the chat there for you in a moment. Might be there already even. So in relation to today's webinar, there are two CPD points awarded from the RCPI, and we're just waiting on confirmation of the CEUs from NIMBY. And when we get those, we can send you out certs. So if you do need a certificate of attendance for today's webinar, you can email the Open Disclosure Office and we will send cert out to you. So as I say, you do need to email us, and the CPD is for attendance at the live webinar only. So just to introduce our speaker today, and before I do that, just to mention our topic today. So when we talk about open disclosure, and the fifth principle of open disclosure is staff support. And as you're aware that we do a lot of work through the Open Disclosure Programme in promoting the principle of staff support and, promoting the care of staff who've been involved in patient safety incidents, and obviously obviously ultimately the care of the patient and their family is paramount, but alongside that we must ensure that we're caring for the staff who've been involved and are affected by patient safety incidents. And today's session is going to be really a general session around health and well-being. So we're really delighted to have Professor Ciaran O'Boyle with us today from the Royal College of Surgeons Ireland. So you're very welcome, Ciaran. We feel honoured to have you here today with us, and thank you so much for agreeing to do the session for us. I think it's going to be a hugely interesting session. So just to give you some of Ciaran's background, Ciaran is a professor of psychology at the RCSI with over 35 years experience as an educator, researcher and trainer. He's currently director of the RCSI Centre for Positive Health Sciences, which he founded in 2019. He established the first department of psychology in an Irish medical school in 1987 and led the team that established RCSI's Institute of Leadership in 2005, which he directed for 15 years. He established the RCSI Dubai in 2007 and led it until 2019. A psychologist and pharmacologist, he lectures extensively in Ireland and internationally and is published widely in the scientific literature and in the media. He has extensive experience as a consultant psychologist for a range of national and international public and private sector organisations in the military, aviation, financial services, education, government and healthcare sectors. So Ciaran, we really are delighted to have you with us, and I'm just going to hand over to you now. So good luck.
Thanks very much, Angela, and thanks for the good luck. Good morning, everybody. Now, this is the stress part for me. We just want to make sure that we can actually share the slides. Once that happens, then I can sort of relax and we'll get into it. Okay. So can I just confirm, Angela, is that sharing okay there?
That's perfect, Ciaran. Yeah, thank you.
That's brilliant. Good morning, everybody, and I'm really delighted to be here. We are always very keen to support the HSE in the great work that you do. So I'm coming from this new centre that we set up in 2019 called the Centre for Positive Health Sciences, and I'll say a little bit more about that at the end, because we're an academic centre of the RCSI. And we're particularly interested in this new concept of what we mean by positive health. And I'm going to say quite a bit about that. And, the reason for us to get into this space, I think we were driven by a number of drivers. One was the rise of non-communicable diseases, cancer, heart disease, and so on, and the need for us to get much more involved in prevention. because we're seeing the burden on the healthcare system just increasing and increasing with aging of populations, with the increasing numbers of people who have these kinds of diseases. And WHO estimates that 80% of those conditions can actually be prevented, but we're not doing a great job yet in terms of that prevention. So we've moved into this well-being space, and I'm putting that in inverted commas. And that's a tricky thing to do for a university like RCSI, because as you know, on the internet, the amount of unscientific nonsense that's out there in the well-being space is enormous. So our approach here is to be very much evidence-based. We're scientists, we're clinicians. We want to get into this space, but in a way that we can stand absolutely over the credibility of what we say. So what we're going to look at in this session is a number of things I want to talk about. I want to talk about the nature of health and positive health in particular, or how we're trying to conceptualize that. I'm going to say something about positive psychology and lifestyle medicine as these two big disciplines that underpin this approach to positive health. And then I want to get into some very practical things that we as individuals can do to improve our own health and well-being. And we're going to look at a whole range of what we call mindsets there. And I'll give you, guidelines as to where you can find more information and, what you can do with each of these for yourself. I will be making a version of these slides available, so don't worry if you don't get notes down. I'll provide a PDF later on today. And then the final place I want to finish up on is the notion of leadership, because even if you're not leading anybody, but particularly if you are in a leadership or management role, I think there's a new way we can think about leadership, which helps us to start thinking about how we create new types of organizations in which people thrive, not just get by, not are stressed or burnt out, but are actually thriving. So that's our agenda for the session. So myself and our team, we've been doing an awful lot of thinking about what exactly it is we mean when we talk about positive health. And I'd like to sort of share it with you where we've got to, and we're not saying that this is completed, but it's just helping us with our thinking. So when we think of health and illness, I'm showing you serious illness and disease down here on the left. And most people, if you ask them, would say, if you say, are you healthy? They're kind of about here. I've labeled this as 0. Yeah, I'm healthy because I'm not sick. So we often tend to think about our health as binary. I'm either healthy or I'm sick. I have a disease. And I'm showing this part of the continuum as a 0 to -10, a sort of a scale or a continuum. And when you think about it, this whole side of the equation is really what traditional healthcare focuses on. And the driver here is pathogenesis. Well, what is it that generates disease? What are the factors that generate disease? What can we do about those? But essentially what we're interested in traditional healthcare is this spectrum from not being sick to being seriously ill or having a disease. And that's really what treatment is focused on. When you think about it, we try to prevent people sliding further to the left, getting worse, try to maintain them in a situation that they're in, or in fact, if we can treat and get a cure, try to get them back up here to the point of not being ill. And it's very important. It's emerged over hundreds of years. That's traditional healthcare, absolutely essential. The problem, though, is what about this side of the equation up here from 0 to +10? What's the science of this? What do we know about this? How do we get people, everybody, not just people who are ill, how do we get everybody from just not being unwell to thriving physically, mentally, socially, having meaning, and having a very strong sense of well-being? Because I think if you look at, most people would probably say they're sort of here somewhere, they're not sick, they're kind of languishing, but they're not actually thriving. And that's really what we're thinking about when we're thinking about positive health. And positive health isn't just something for those of us who aren't ill. A lot of what we're learning here in this space is also relevant for people who are sick or unwell. So when we formulated this first, we had positive health up here as the kind of, end point. But we've been rethinking that and saying, well, really, you can have positive health all the way along. What's important is, what direction are you facing, and are you moving in a direction? So somebody who's down here, who's getting better, who's improving their well-being, is engaging in positive health. It's not just something for up here. And if you think about positive psychology, which I'll say something about in a moment, that's really how positive psychology emerged. Martin Seligman, who is the leader of leading light in positive psychology, said, really, we know a great deal in psychology and psychiatry about this side of the equation, about depression and anxiety and stress and so on, schizophrenia. But we know very little about, psychological thriving or gratitude, strength, love, those kinds of positive human emotions. So positive psychology was a science that emerged really to counterbalance the over focus on the negative. As Seligman puts it, we know an awful lot about human misery. We don't know a great deal about, joy and happiness and those kinds of things. And then emerging very strongly in an area we've become very interested in is this new specialty called lifestyle medicine. And lifestyle medicine has really emerged as a discipline which is focused on decreasing risk, primarily focusing on saying, if you're here and you're okay, let's help you not to go here. Let's look at the risk factors and prevent you becoming ill. Or if you are ill, are there things you can do with your lifestyle to actually help move you in this direction? The question is out though as to whether really lifestyle medicine has a lot yet to say about this side of the equation here. So that's kind of where we've got to. And you'll notice I've nested all of this in the context of environment, because again, health is not just down to individual choices. Poverty, for example, access to healthcare literacy, public policies around smoking, taxes on alcohol, questions about whether junk food outlets can be close to schools. There's a whole range of variables in our environments which have a massive influence on our health. So it's not just a matter of getting people to change their lifestyles. There's a whole other dimension to this. And it gets even more complicated, this whole way of thinking, when you start to think, well, somebody, if we think about the constituents of health, being physically well, mentally, socially, the original WHO definition was complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. A lot of scholars now would add meaning to that if your life is meaningful, purposeful, if you've got a sense of meaning, that's particularly important. But you can see, as I'm showing here, we can be on different places on this axis, So, for example, you could have somebody here who's physically unwell, but is mentally feels that they're very well, is doing badly socially, but is gaining a sense of meaning and, a reevaluation of their life based on coping with an illness. Let's take cancer, for example. So it's very, very complex when we start to unpack it. But I think the key thing I'd like to focus on is this idea that we're trying to develop now a science of positive health. And we're trying to see what are the variables, what are the factors that help to move everybody in that direction of thriving. And I'm going to focus on some of those factors now as we go through the rest of the session. And I would say I'd love to get some feedback on this, because this is an emerging model. We're talking about it to lots of people. We're learning as we go about the model, and we're trying to see, can we develop it to a point where it makes sense and allows us to do good research. So as I've said, the underpinning kind of disciplines underneath positive health, and it's not just lifestyle medicine, positive psychology, public health medicine, preventive medicine, integrative medicine, behavioral medicine, health psychology. A whole range of disciplines are important. But positive psychology is a big one. In positive psychology, here's the definition from Marty Seligman and Mike Csikszentmihalyi in 2000 when they started to talk about this, that it's the scientific study. Now, scientific is incredibly important here. This isn't just common sense, this is science. It's how do we do the sciences? The scientific study of optimal human functioning as thriving that aims to discover and promote the factors that allow individuals and communities to thrive. That's really what positive psychology is about. How can we use science to find out what are the factors that will help us as individuals, societies, communities, even countries to actually thrive? And it's based on a couple of insights. One is that treating mental illness is not the same as promoting mental health. If we treat somebody who's got a mental illness and we bring them back to that 0 point, well, now they don't have a mental illness, but it doesn't mean that they're mentally healthy. They're thriving. There's a whole other set of things that we need to do to help somebody move up that scale towards +10. So the focus here isn't just on the absence of the negative, it's on the presence of the positive. And positive psychology is very interested in these kinds of things: joy, serenity, courage, optimism, peace, love, strength, and so on. We recently pulled together, the team and I, a lot of the interventions that have emerged from positive psychology and lifestyle medicine, and we published them in a book earlier last year called Positive Health, 100+ research-based interventions. So we were very keen only to include things that people could do themselves that actually had scientific evidence behind them to show that they were actually effective. So that's one of the big foundations under this way of thinking. The second one is lifestyle medicine. And here's Gary Egger's definition of lifestyle medicine. The application of environmental, so that's the society thing, behavioral, medical, and motivational principles to the management of lifestyle-related health problems in a clinical setting, and that includes self-care and self-management. So the pillars then, and you'll be familiar with this, I'm sure, the pillars are diet, physical activity, sleep, increasingly important, seen as increasingly important, stress management, the development of very good positive relationships, and then cutting down the abuse of substances like alcohol, cigarettes, and so on. They're the 6 big pillars of lifestyle medicine. And you'll probably be aware we're now starting to see, for example, if we look at relationships here, we're starting to see social prescribing emerging as one of the things that doctors can do for patients. You're prescribed to actually increase their social activity. And that is coming from a lot of good research to show that loneliness is as bad for us as smoking. In one study, the health risk of loneliness in terms of mortality, in terms of death, was as high as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So we're starting to get a sense of the science. And what's really interesting for us about this as psychologists is all of these are behaviors, if you think about it. You know, diet's a behavior, eating, taking exercise, how we sleep, managing stress, building relationships, and using substances. It's all behaviors. So we're starting to see now a focusing on these. And the really interesting thing is they're all interlinked. And the other fascinating thing about this is that we're now starting to understand the biology or the physiology that underpins these processes. So let me take an example there. If we take something like physical activity and diet, we know that physical activity, if exercise were a drug, it would be the most successful drug in the world, because the impact, the positive impact on a whole variety of biological, physiological systems is phenomenal. Diet, the same. We know that some of these variables not just influence how our bodies are functioning, but they also influence how our genes are being expressed. And as many of you will know, there's a whole new science called epigenetics. And what epigenetics is showing is that even the way we think, our attitudes will influence whether genes in our cells are switched on or switched off. Wonderful recent book by Professor Roseanne Kenny from Trinity, who runs the huge TILDA study. Her book is called Age Proof. I'd highly recommend it. And Roseanne has shown research that shows that your attitude to aging, how you think about aging, the attitude itself, if we control for lots of other variables, the attitude affects how genes associated with aging are expressed. So we're starting to see emerging a kind of an understanding of the interrelationships between what's going on in our minds and what's going on in our body. The microbiome is another fantastic example where what happens in our gut is very closely linked to what happens in our brains. So serotonin, for example, that big neurotransmitter that's associated with happiness and its lack with depression, 95% of that is produced in our gut. So this microbiome research again is pointing to the fact that we have artificially for hundreds of years separated out mind and body. And one of the great, really exciting new areas of science is actually working out how this interconnected system functions. Okay, so that's really to kind of set the background in terms of what positive health is, what positive psychology is, and then to introduce some of these ideas around lifestyle medicine. And again, there's lots of very interesting and accessible literature, good scientific literature, popular books, and so on all of this now. Okay, so having set that scene broadly, what I'd like to do now is drill down a little bit and pull out some of the big ticket items in terms of what we as individuals can do to improve our own well-being. How do you move yourself up on that scale from -10 or hopefully 0 up to +10? What are the kinds of things that we know about? And I'm going to introduce you to an idea, a concept called mindsets, which are basically the ways we think. And we're going to look at a number of these: the growth mindset, the optimism mindset. We're going to look at something called PERMA, a way of thinking about happiness. Very important. We're going to look at strengths. And then I'm going to say something about the importance of meditation and mindfulness, because once again, we're learning amazing things about how meditation actually works in terms of its impact on the body. And then in the final part, as I said, we'll go on and we'll talk a little bit about leadership. Right. So mindsets then. This is the wonderful Carol Dweck. She's been a professor in Stanford for about 50 years now. And she came to speak to us in RCSI back in 2018. And I'd highly recommend that book that I'm showing you there by Carol, Mindset. It's very, very widely available and very, very widely read. And the basic idea, Carol was working with small children. She's an educational psychologist back about 50 years ago. And they had these kids in the labs, kind of a schoolroom laboratory. And they were giving them these different kinds of puzzles to do. These are 4, 5, 6-year-old children. And the puzzles would get more difficult. So as the child completed one puzzle, the next one was a little bit more difficult. And Carol and her team noticed that some children, when the puzzle started to get difficult, said something like, I don't want to play this game anymore. You know, I'm going to go over here and play with something else. They gave up because the puzzles were too difficult. Other children, on the other hand, when the puzzles got difficult, said, oh, I love this. I really like the challenge of this. Can I bring these puzzles home to my parents? And then they started thinking, there's something very different about the way these children are approaching these problems or these challenges. And they came up with this concept of mindset, that the way the mind of the children was set was different. So the fixed mindset children said, I don't want to do it anymore because I'm going to fail at it. It's not easy. The growth mindset children said to themselves, this is great. I'm really being challenged. I love this. I'm learning as I'm going along. And over 50 years now of research has been done on mindsets, not just in children, but in teenagers, in adults, in the elderly, whole range of studies. And I've tried to summarize here the basic idea behind fixed and growth mindsets. So let's take people with fixed mindsets first, and we all have fixed mindsets to a certain extent. So people with fixed mindsets believe that their intelligence level, their talent level is static. What you're born with is the intelligence you'll have for the rest of your life. That level of intelligence is what you have. Their desire is to look smart. So that means that if they're challenged and they're likely to fail, they get very uncomfortable with that because they feel they're going to look stupid, which means they're going to avoid challenges where they feel they look stupid. Their kind of core idea is that I shouldn't really have to make an effort here. My basic ability, my talents should be enough for me to be able to do this. I shouldn't have to struggle here. They don't really like criticism because that goes back to this idea, I want to look smart. I don't like criticism. And if other people are successful, well, then they kind of feel threatened by that. So often these people with fixed mindsets, they can be very bright and so on, but they can plateau early. They have a kind of a deterministic view of the world. And this isn't just about dealing with challenges and so on. An example of a fixed mindset would be, say, in relationships, that there's only one person for me, the love of my life, and I have to find that person. If I don't find them, nobody else will fit. That's a fixed mindset. There's just one person. I mean, I reckon about 70% of people could probably get by with 70% of people and be fine, but that's a fixed mindset, that there's only one person. Or I'm no good at X. I'm no good at maths, so I'm never even going to try. I'm not going to put myself in a situation where I might fail. It's a fixed mindset. Now, people with a growth mindset, on the other hand, believe that their intelligence can be developed, and the evidence is it can. You can increase your intellectual levels. Their desire isn't so much to look smart, their desire is to learn. And that means that they embrace challenges. So when a challenge happens, they get stuck in because there might be learning in this for them. When the going gets tough, they get going. They persist in the face of obstacles. And they understand that, to actually achieve something, it's a combination of our talents plus the effort that we put in. So they see effort as a path to learning, a path to mastery. They're open to learning from criticism. If somebody else is successful, they'll say, okay, what can I learn from that? Is there something in that for me that I can do, that I can learn? And they generally do much better. Now, if you think about two athletes, for example, one of whom is more talented than the other, but the other spends more time training and actually is more successful. It's the combination of the talent plus the effort is what leads to the success. And in our present context, one of the ways of thinking about this, particularly this idea of learning from mistakes, is that when errors happen in systems, like medical error, for example, happens in a system, a growth mindset would say, we need to learn from that. We need to find out what precisely the causes of that were, to source analysis and so on, FEMA, and work out how we're going to prevent this from happening again. Now, here's the real beauty about Carl's work and the work of other psychologists in this space. We can change from a fixed to a growth mindset. We can alter our mindsets, and we can teach children in particular to shift from a fixed to a growth mindset. They're very big on this in Victoria, in Australia, in the primary school system. I was out in some of the schools a few years ago, and children were talking to me about their growth mindsets, which means that when they make a mistake, for example, their training is that they learn from the mistake and move on, not that they get completely wrapped up in the mistake. So some of the mindsets I'm going to talk about now link back into this idea of growth mindset. And by the way, for any of you who have children or young people at home, that book, Carl Dweck's book on mindset, is really well worth reading. One of the examples from that is we often say to our kids, you're absolutely brilliant, you're wonderful. Your child does something, achieves something, you say, you are such a little genius, you're fantastic. Carl would say that that's moving to a fixed mindset, because you're saying to the child, talent got you through. Whereas if you say, I love the way that you actually tried there, I love the effort that you put in there, you did really well to stick at that when the going got tough. That's growth mindset kind of talking. you know. So if we build our children up to say that you're fantastic and everything you do is fantastic and so on, when they meet adversity, the problem is that they can actually have a fixed mindset in that context. So Carol goes into that in great detail in that book, fixed mindset. Well worth, and you'll see her speaking on YouTube and various other places as well. So for us as professionals, I think the journey to a growth mindset then is to embrace challenges, which I think we do as professionals, to persist in the face of setbacks, to understand that effort is part of the journey. When it's tough, we just keep going. We understand that worthwhile things don't come easy, that we're open to learning from criticism and feedback. If others are resilient or successful, we can find inspiration in that. And it was very important during COVID, and we wrote a lot about this, trying to help reduce burnout in health professionals. Very good report by the American Institute of Medicine showing that health professionals who could kind of key in to the mindset that brought them into medicine or nursing or pharmacy or management, indeed, whatever it was that brought them into healthcare in the first place, that vocational side, wanting to do good, wanting to care for people, tapping back into that was one of the ways of preventing burnout during COVID. The second mindset I want to look at is positive mindset. This is a wonderful social psychologist called Roy Baumeister. He's in his late 70s now. And he wrote this fantastic paper in 2001 called Bad is Stronger Than Good. And basically what he did was he brought together a lot of research to show that we as human beings are far more aware and sensitive to bad things that happen than we are to good things, to positive things to happen. We're kind of hardwired to see the negative. The greater power of bad events over good ones is found in everyday life. So we have more words, for example, for negative events. We have more words for negative emotions in all languages. Think about if you get a performance review, in your workplace, and 95% of it is excellent, and there's 5% you might want to improve a bit. What's the bit that you tend to focus on? Well, it's pretty likely to be the 5%. And Baumeister and other psychologists think the reason for that is that when we were evolving, the threats came from negative events. So the idea is that we go through our day with a kind of a bias that we're much more aware of negative events than we are of positive events. And that's kind of pretty tiring. You only have to listen to the news to see the focus on the negative makes news rather than the focus on the positive. So there is an antidote to this, and the antidote came from a lot of early research done by the positive psychologists, where they actually developed this intervention, had people do it, had control groups do other things, and they found that this is incredibly effective in changing that bias that we have from negative to positive. And it's really simple. You just keep a notebook beside your bed and you write down, preferably before you go to sleep, you just jot down, maybe as bullet points, 3 good things that happened today and why those things went well. That's it. Simple as that. Now, if you do that for a week or two, the evidence is that significantly improves your sense of well-being. And it's a bit more sophisticated than it might appear at first sight. There's a couple of things going on here. The first is you start to become more aware in your ordinary day of positive things happening, and you start labeling them as positive because you're going to write them down later on in the evening. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, by doing that, that sort of counterweights the negatives. You're still aware of the negatives, but not everything is negative. And the third thing, which we don't fully understand, is that we think you sleep in a different way. If you're going to sleep with that kind of mindset, your sleep is affected positively because you're now going to sleep thinking about the positives rather than just ruminating over the negative things that have happened. Very simple exercise, very well worth trying. I know a lot of people do this with children, to get their children at the end of the day to just sit down and talk a little bit about good things that happened during the day, even draw them, write them down. And it's a really interesting way of starting to correct that negative bias that we have. Another way of thinking about our negative bias is to do with pessimism. Now, if you're a particularly pessimistic person, there are ways of changing that. And this is from a wonderful book that Marty Seligman wrote as long ago as 1998 now, called Learned Optimism. And the idea here is that we can learn to be more optimistic, even if we're pessimists. Seligman himself would say that he's an arch pessimist, but he's actually learned to change his thinking. And a good way to change from being a pessimist to an optimist is to use this particular mind hack here. It comes from cognitive behavior therapy. And the idea is when you're being particularly pessimistic, you tune into your most catastrophic thoughts. You start saying, well, what's the worst thing that can happen? How bad is this? You really get into it. And then you treat those thoughts as if they're being said to you by somebody whose goal in life is to make you miserable. And then argue back and dispute as you would with another person rationally. So what you're actually starting to do is challenge your automatically pessimistic thoughts. And by doing so, that increases your level of optimism. Now, why is that important? Well, quite apart from the fact that being optimistic or being more optimistic or learning to be more optimistic is helpful in terms of our mental health, there's some amazing new research emerging to show that it's also particularly important for our physical health. This is a major systematic review and meta-analysis that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, highly prestigious journal, in 2019, called The Association of Optimism with Cardiovascular Events and All-Cause Mortality. So we're not just looking at the relationship between heart attacks and strokes and so on, we're looking at the relationship between optimism and all causes of death. And you'll see the meaning here. I've just highlighted down here on the left, the meaning of the findings. The findings suggest that a mindset of optimism is associated with lower cardiovascular risk, and that the promotion of optimism and reduction in pessimism may be important in preventive health. And if you remember what I said earlier about Roseanne Kenny's work in Trinity, we know that there's linkages between our attitudes and how our genes are being expressed, both in terms of genes that drive disease, the genes that are important for our immune functioning, the genes that are turned off and turned on in aging. So again, we're starting to see these interesting linkages. So it is worth thinking about how optimistic you are and starting to ask the question, could you increase your mindset of optimism? Now, when it comes to the happiness mindset, PERMA, this is a kind of a shorthand for thinking about your psychological well-being. And I'm showing you an early photograph of Marty Seligman here. This is some of Marty's work. And the idea of PERMA is this: if we want to think about happiness, when you ask people about happiness, a lot of people think happiness is just about feeling positive emotions, such as happiness or joy or excitement or contentment. You win the lottery, you buy a new car, something goes really good, you get promoted at work, you feel happy. That's what happiness is. And that's certainly part of it. But a lot of positive psychologists would say that's not actually even the most important part of it, that there are other dimensions to being happy. One of these is engagement. So the E of PERMA stands for engagement. That part of our sense of happiness and well-being comes from engaging in activities that are interesting and absorbing. And we know a lot from the research by Mike Csikszentmihalyi that we can get into a state of flow, what's called flow. And you're in a state of flow when time kind of stops. You're so immersed in what you're doing, you're so wrapped up in it that you don't even have a sense of time going by. And you lose a sense of yourself and a sense of time. You can get it through music, through sports, through reading, sometimes through the workplace and so on. So that's the engagement. The R, as you might imagine, is to do with nurturing healthy relationships with those around us, that's important for our overall happiness. And we know, as I was saying earlier, that loneliness is a killer. It's extremely bad for our health, and well, not just our mental health, our physical health as well. But relationships provide us with attachment, with support, with feeling valued, with being loved. And it is increasingly clear that we as humans have a biological system which has evolved for connection. We know, for example, one of the hormones involved in that system is oxytocin. We know that we know a lot about the stress system, the activity, pituitary adrenal axis, where we pump out cortisol and adrenaline when we're stressed. We're now starting to learn about something called a calm and connect system. And that's a biological endocrine hormonal system which allows us to decrease our levels of anxiety and increase connection with others. We know the vagal nerve is particularly important in that system. So again, relationships absolutely key. This one is particularly important for us in healthcare. Meaning. That meaning and purpose in our daily lives are crucial for happiness. So if we're pursuing highly valued goals, and often that involves serving something bigger than ourselves, serving the common good, for example, that's particularly important for happiness. It's one of the reasons why retirement can be very difficult for people, who are making a contribution. We know that one of the ways of thinking about depression is it's a kind of a form of loss of meaning, meaninglessness. So meaning and purpose, really key to psychological well-being. And in the helping professions, it's almost a given that our purpose is helping and assisting others, particularly helping and assisting others who are less fortunate, who are unwell, who are weaker perhaps than ourselves. And the A of the PERMA is accomplishment, that we work, or in our private lives or non-working lives, we have a sense of mastery and achievement. We have the resources to do our jobs properly, for example. We get a sense that we're actually achieving something in our workplace. So again, this is something that's very important when we think about well-being in the workplace. How can we set up workplaces so that people are getting these kinds of elements of happiness, that they're actually being fulfilled in these? And again, during COVID, we got very interested in this. This is a lovely report from the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine in the States, taking action against clinician burnout, a systems approach. And basically the conclusion was that meaning and purpose in life are synergistic. That this was with physicians, but it'd be relevant for nurses, pharmacists, any health professional, administrators. A sense of calling strongly associated with meaning in life was found to be inversely associated with burnout. So the more you had a sense of purpose and meaning, the less likely you were to burn out. And finding meaning in work protects physicians, nurses, and other health professionals from burnout. So there's a lot we can do in terms of creating organizations in which people find their contribution is meaningful. The next mindset I want to focus on is strengths, and this stuff is just brilliant. The research here is superb. We know the group who do this work. I've given you the link there. It's the VIA Institute of Character. If you go on to viacharacter.org, you'll find a lot of this material. And basically, this was a group of scientists, 50 of them. They spent 3 years working on this. And they said, look, we know an awful lot about human vulnerabilities and weaknesses. What do we know about strengths? So they went around lots of different countries in the world, talked to lots of people, professionals, lay people. They looked at different philosophies, different religions, and they identified that there are basically 24 human strengths. And we all have them to a greater and lesser degree. And here they are. This is the VIA classification here. So there are strengths like creativity, perseverance, social intelligence, teamwork, humility, hope, humor, and so on. There's 24 of these strengths. And you can see that they all kind of contribute to these 6 different virtues: wisdom, courage, humanity, justice, temperance, and transcendence. And again, fantastic research behind this. So, it's one of the strongest lines of research to come out of positive psychology. Now, here's the thing. You can go onto the VIA website, and I really would recommend it if you haven't done it already, And you can do a questionnaire there. It's free. It's 220 questions. And you will get back then a rank ordering for yourself of the 24 strengths, from your strongest one based on the questionnaire down to the one that you're weakest on. Now, that's not set in stone, because again, this is kind of orientating you to what your top strengths might be. And there are other ways to help to find out whether those are the case or not, like just becoming more aware. So here's somebody for whom love of learning, judgment, perspective, curiosity, and fairness, they're the top strengths for this person. And that's really, really valuable information, because what you then do is you start to use those strengths. We call them signature strengths, your top 5 or 6. If you can identify those signature strengths and start to use them more and more, these are strengths that feel like you, they feel right. You're energized when you're using them. If you can use those in your relationships, your work, and in your leisure, you might find you have strengths that you didn't even know you had. That significantly increases your sense of well-being. If you can choose work that lets you use your strengths every day, or recraft your work so that you're using your strengths, significantly increases your well-being. And if you're a manager or a leader, it can be really worthwhile to have your team do the strengths questionnaire and share the information, because that means when you're making decisions about projects and work and so on, you can actually structure things so that people play to their strengths. I've come to believe, after nearly 40 years in this area, that the real task of management and leadership is actually finding out what people's strengths are and structuring things so that they're playing to their strengths, they're using their strengths. People have a great sense of happiness, well-being, satisfaction when they're able to use their strengths. It's probably the best thing to come out so far out of the whole positive psychology science. The final mindset then that I just want to touch on briefly, and I don't have time to go into this in detail, is meditation. I mean, we've known about meditation for thousands of years, but it's really only laterally that we're starting to understand how profound the effects of meditation are. This is from a major report in the Scientific American in 2018. And it might come as a surprise. We know that meditation changes the way our brains and minds function. We know that meditation reduces stress. We know that we think differently. It affects our mood. But I think what we weren't aware of was that meditation actually changes the physical structure of our brains. So you'll see here, for example, in the review, gyrification. Those are those folds in the cortex, the outside of our brains. Meditation, 10 minutes a day, we're talking very little here, actually increases the number of gyri in the cortex. And we're actually starting to see from a lot of new research that there are a lot of these areas, prefrontal cortex, for example, these areas of our brains that are involved in planning, for example, these areas here, the amygdala, for example, involved in emotion, that these areas actually get thicker. They actually change their physical structure if we are practicing meditation. Now, again, because I don't have time to go into this, I point you in the direction of a program that we've put online. It's free, developed by my wonderful colleague, Dr. Padraig Dunn, who is fascinating. He's both a psychotherapist and an immunologist, which is a very unusual combination. And Padraig put together an 8-week training program on meditation. We call it attention-based training, and that's available, and it's free for anybody who wants to get on there and learn how to do meditation. And it, as we say, it doesn't take much. 10 minutes a day makes a significant difference. Okay, so that's a trawl through some of the mindsets that have emerged from lifestyle medicine, positive psychology. And I want to finish now by talking a bit about leadership and types of leadership, particularly in the workplace. And what I want to emphasize here is that when we're thinking about stress at work, or we're thinking about the happiness at work and so on, you know, it's not all about us as individuals. An awful lot has to do with the nature of our organizations, the way they're managed, the kind of culture that exists, the kind of climate that exists. In our present context with open disclosure, we know that, for example, creating a non-blame culture was a major factor in starting to learn more about accidents and near misses in complex systems. So we have this tendency, I think, to focus on stress at work by focusing on individuals. This is my favorite quote on this. It's from Vincent van Gogh, the great artist. He said, "I put my heart and soul into my work, and I've lost my mind in the process." It's such a sad thing that many people's mental health is destroyed by their work. And I think there's a fundamental problem here. And I was involved in this area back in the late 70s, early 80s. And I've always had a major reservation about how we approach this. Here's a canary in a mine. Canaries were used in mines to detect noxious gases like methane. If the canary keeled over, well, then it was a good idea to get out of the mine. The answer to the problems of stress in the workplace aren't really to create more resilient canaries, but that's how we tend to approach it. We tend to say, well, you need to become more resilient, or we'll put on yoga at lunchtime classes. Now, I'm not saying yoga at lunchtime is a bad thing. I think it's a very good thing, but a lot of the problems that individuals have in the workplace are problems over which they personally have very little control. They're under-resourced. They're not properly trained for what they're doing. They're poorly managed. There's a culture of a climate of bullying in the world. A lot of these are factors over which the person themselves can't do an awful lot. So I think we have to think differently about this. And what this often comes down to is leadership. Now, when you start talking about leadership, people think about leaders. This is the classic way of thinking about leadership. It's Napoleon, David's famous painting of Napoleon crossing the Alps. And this is a very ingrained way of thinking about leadership in our culture, and not just ours. I mean, we've done a lot of work in the Middle East and in Asia. It's pretty ingrained there too, that so our leadership is about the leader, that person who knows the way to go, who has all the answers. But that's only one way of thinking about leadership. The other way of thinking about leadership is all of us are capable of leadership. It mightn't be that kind of leadership, but there are other kinds of leadership. And one of the most important, I think, and this is what we developed and worked on in the Institute of Leadership, is this idea of authentic leadership. And the idea here is that the person, the leader, brings with them a number of things: their autobiography, their life course, their experience, their psychological capital, so their knowledge, their professional expertise, their personality, their capability, their skills, and very importantly, their moral perspective, their sense of ethics, of right and wrong. That's what the leader brings. But the organization also has to bring something, and that is a highly developed, supportive climate. It's very hard to be an authentic leader in a toxic organization. In fact, it's practically impossible. But if we get both of these being developed, we then get leaders who have an increased sense of self-awareness and are very good at regulating their behaviors. And that leads to constant self-development and sustained performance. So this is a different way of thinking about leadership. This is about not bolting leadership onto somebody. It's about developing them from the inside out in terms of what type of leadership is most suitable, that fits best for them. And if you're thinking about this, I've come to the view that the laboratory for one's leadership development is your own autobiography. It's what you bring, it's your history, it's your characteristics, it's your strengths, it's your knowledge, it's your expertise, it's your whole life course. That's what you bring to leadership, which means, of course, that people can lead in very different ways. So the elements of authentic leadership in terms of development, well, there's four. Time isn't going to allow me to get into detail on this, but I've given you a couple of references there if you want to follow up on this. The four areas for development are knowing yourself. demonstrating and understanding your own strengths and weaknesses, how you make sense of the world. So self-knowledge is central to leadership. Doing the right thing, being guided by an internal moral perspectives. We're always getting decisions. There's an easy way and the right way. Which way do we jump? Well, if it's not that important, fine. But on certain matters that are important, where the values are important, where there's an ethical or moral issue, we need as leaders to be making the right decisions, doing the right thing, being genuine and compassionate. So good leaders aren't different in different environments or different circumstances. You see the real person. It's the real person. They're authentic and they're fair. They're fair-minded. John Adair, who's written a lot on leadership, says if you think about it like a triangle, it balances. You know, there's the needs of the leader, there's the needs of the people being led, and there's the needs of the situation. And you're always trying to make the right decision based on the balance between those three different needs. Sometimes one will trump the others. I mightn't get my way because the needs of the people and the needs of the situation are more important, for example. Or there's a moral issue, I have to get my way because that's the most important thing here, because there's a right and wrong way to do things. So we know a great deal now about how to develop leadership. And I'm not just talking with people at the top of organizations, I'm talking about everybody. We use something called distributed leadership. I've seen cleaners in hospitals taking leadership roles because they were passionate about doing a good job. That's right at the bottom of a hierarchy. Leadership can be distributed throughout an organization. If you want to check your own authentic leadership, this is a very good website, MindGarden. So if you go on to mindgarden.com, you'll find a questionnaire there developed by the great Bruce Avolio, where you can actually assess the extent to which you personally are using authentic leadership. And then that can help you to see where are your areas for development. Because nobody gets there. We're always on a developmental journey. You know, leadership is a journey. Leadership development is a journey. So the key there is finding out where you're at, what kind of leadership you engage in, and then starting to tweak that to develop your leadership. So the guidelines really from this are learn from your life story. Think about, what are your biases? What are your experiences? What are your attitudes to authority, to control, to development? Becoming much more self-aware, particularly of your biases. Practicing your values and principles, working out what are your values, what do you stand for, and what will you not stand for. Balancing your extrinsic and intrinsic motivations. That's that idea of that triangle I was telling you about. Your needs, the needs of your people, the needs of the situation. Building your support team. Nobody can do it all. This kind of superhuman leader thing is just it's nonsense. Integrating your life by staying grounded. You can do so much. You can only control so much. And the great thing about authentic leaders is authentic leaders are people who develop leadership in others. They don't feel threatened by juniors giving good advice or coming up with good ideas. They'll take good ideas from anywhere, but they're wonderful people at developing others. So they get the job done and develop their people. Now, the final thing I want to just touch on briefly is this idea of positive organizations. There's a wonderful researcher called Otto Scharmer. He's based in MIT, and he wrote a lovely book called Theory U, the letter U. For anyone who's interested in leadership, it's one of the best things around. And one thing that Otto said is that our major error is we try to learn exclusively from the past rather than from the future as it emerges. What he's saying there is very often in our organizations, we do things the way we always did them, or we solve problems the way we always solved other problems in the past. But he says the future is already here. The future is changing things. So we know, for example, in healthcare, technology is going to change the future. We know wearables are going to change. Robotics, artificial intelligence, demographic changes in population. There's all kinds of things that mean that if we're training somebody for a healthcare system that exists now, that training is going to be out of date in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. We should be thinking more about training people for 10 years out, for 15, for 20 years out. We've got to be much more aware of this future that's emerging. And that leads us to the notion of what a positive organization is. And one of the best people writing about this is Bob Quinn from the University of Michigan. And I'll encapsulate this in a story that Bob tells. He says there's a Native American reservation. It's a clinic, it's an outpatients clinic, general practice. It's late in the evening. You have one young doctor there. He's closing up the clinic. Everybody else has gone home. And this elderly man comes in and he says to him, can I help you? And the old man says nothing. And he says, well, if you don't tell me what's wrong, I can't help you. And the old man says to him, he said, tell me, doctor, he said, can you dance? Do you know how to dance? The young doctor realizes this is one of the medicine men, the elders of the tribe, and where dance is used as a healing approach to healing. And he says to him, can you teach me to dance? The elder says, I can teach you, but you have to hear the music. And what Bob says is very often in our organizations, what we do is we try to change the dance. We try to re-engineer the systems, the structures, the processes. Our focus is on the dance. The quickest way to change the dance is to change the music. Now, what's the music in an organization? The music in an organization is the culture and the climate. That's what the music is. And where is that set? That's set really at the top and set throughout. So the attitudes that we bring in leadership and management to our organizations, that's the music. The dance will follow the music. The quickest way to change the dance is to change the music. And what are the key principles of that? Well, what Bob would say, and there's a lot of research on this again, creating a sense of purpose. Everybody in the organization needs to know how their work connects to the purpose and particularly to the greater good. Creating and nurturing authentic, real conversations, not politics, not micro-politics. Seeing possibilities, not just problems. We're great at seeing problems. Embracing the common good. I was speaking to a judge yesterday, and he said one of the great things about being a judge that he loves is the fact that he's capable of establishing restorative justice for a victim. And he says that the perpetrator benefits because they have to make right, the victim benefits because they have to make right, and society benefits also. So the common good, and we in healthcare, the common good is really what we are about. We are absolutely about the common good. And then as processes change and as they emerge and you start to create these positive, well then trust the emergent process. Don't try to just control it too much. Here's an example of a fantastic study using this thinking. It's a bit old now, it's 2007. They looked at 29 nursing units in the United States. And they got the leadership in those to use 6 positive practices: caring, compassionate support, forgiveness, being inspiring, showing meaning and respect, and working with dignity, integrity, and gratitude. And they found everything improved. Patient satisfaction, pain management, the organization. They measured all of this. Participation in hospital affairs, foundations for quality care, resource, whole range of things. And there's lots of research now to show that if we start to use these kinds of approaches, lots of positives come from that. And they're simple things. I'll just give you some examples here. Making meetings uplifting, ending on a positive note, starting on a positive note. Celebrating and prolonging good news. We're really good at kind of prolonging bad news. In challenging situations, focusing on the things we can control. Avoiding continually recycling negativity. Mapping out team strengths. Showing appreciation and gratitude. Helping staff to identify the meaning of their contribution. Sorry about the there. I hadn't noticed that before. And then for us as managers, taking care of our own health. Put on your oxygen mask, your own oxygen mask first. If you're a healthcare professional, it's really, really important that you look after yourself. So finally then, if I can compare those two approaches, this kind of complex sort of slide, but bear with me. The deficit approach, the one that we use an awful lot, is a problem-solving approach. We try to identify the key problems and challenges and get consultants in to help us to do that. Fine. Generate alternative solutions based on root causes. Okay. Evaluate and choose the best solution and implement and follow up to show that the problem is solved. That's A long tradition of us doing that in our organizations. Here's the abundance approach, positive organization approach. Identify peak experiences when individuals and organizations are at their best. When are we really good? What do we do extremely well? Identify and understand the enablers of optimal performance. What's allowing us to do very well in those areas we do very well? Creating sustainable impact by continuing and further developing the enablers of performance, optimal performance. What do we do well? What's helping us do that well? How do we do more of that? And then design interventions to create ideal desired future based on that optimal performance. So if I'm a manager, in this kind of approach, my role is exclusively identifying and solving problems. Success is measured on the problem solved, but my focus is always on the negative. If I'm a leader or manager thinking about it this way, I'm trying to identify and actualize potential. My bottom line is how well are my people doing? How well is the planet doing? Because green is so important now. And if I'm in the private sector, profit, or if I'm in the public sector, quality. But here the focus is positive. And there's a whole research approach associated with this called appreciative inquiry, where we go in to see what's going well, what's done well, what do people do well. God knows we hear about it when we do something wrong or we make a mistake. We hear very little about it, about all the things that go well, the 95% of things that are going well. So finally then, in summary, we've been trying very hard to develop this area of positive health in the RCSI, in the university. We're kind of struggling with it a bit, but I think we are making some progress. And I do think that it would be helpful for us to get some feedback. For any of you interested in this way of thinking, we have a professional diploma in positive health. It's a 30 credit 1 year program with 70 people doing that at the moment, health professionals mainly. We've a master's degree now in positive health coaching. So we think health coaching is going to become a huge part of healthcare going forward. And the people who do that learn about lifestyle medicine, positive psychology, but they also qualify as coaches. We have a PhD program in positive health, and we've just launched a professional doctorate in positive health. And if you're interested in the Science of Happiness programs I was talking about, you'll get those on our website as well. It's the Science of Happiness. They're free to anybody who wants to use them. This is my last slide. You'll be glad to hear. I became very interested in the Stoic philosophers during COVID, and learned a great deal from them. Many of you may be familiar with the book, The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, who was one of the last of the great Roman emperors. And these were his notes to himself. And, you know, Marcus has a great deal to say about how to live life well and how to live life with virtue. But the Stoic I've selected to finish on is Epictetus, who, as you see there, lived from 50 AD to 135 AD, so 2,000 years ago now. Epictetus was born a slave in Phrygia, northern Greece, the borders of Greece and Turkey. He was born a slave, brought to Rome. When he was a child, his master broke his leg to demonstrate his power over him. So he walked with a limp for the rest of his life. He was sold to another master who allowed him to go and listen to talks on philosophy in Rome, in the Forum. He became very interested in philosophy. And he got his freedom when he was 30 years of age. And he set up a new school of philosophy, Stoic philosophy, in Rome. And then when the Emperor Domitian kicked the philosophers out of Rome, he went back to Phrygia and set up one of the most important schools of philosophy in ancient Greece. Amazing guy. One of the things Epictetus said 2,000 years ago now, I think is just worth remembering and reflecting on. He said, "The chief task in life is simply this, to identify and separate matters so that I can say clearly to myself which are the externals not under my control and which have to do with the choices I actually control. Where then do I look for good and evil? Not to the uncontrollable externals, but within myself to the choices that are my own." And I think what's amazing about that is That's mindset. That's a growth mindset. But that's somebody talking about it, what, 2,000 years ago. So I've run a little bit over. Sorry about that. I'm going to stop there, and if I can stop sharing, we can. I think we might be taking questions, Angela. I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, I don't think anybody was happy when you came to your last slide there, Ciaran. I think we just want to listen to you for the rest of the day. Actually, it's such an interesting topic and so much kind of for us to take home with us today, so many messages. And really, I suppose in the chat, there's just really very positive comments about the presentation. Just, a big thank you to you for the presentation. So insightful, lots for people to take home with them. There's a comment there about, the concept, safety concept 1 and 2, and I think it was from Sam there, yeah, excellent example of safety 1 versus safety 2 concept. Do you have any comment to make on that at all, Ciaran? Or
I'm not familiar with the distinction, Angela, safety 1 and safety 2.
Okay, no, that's fine. I don't really know it very well myself, so maybe leave that one. Again, I just had a question for you. I suppose when I was looking at your chart in the beginning, where you said maybe a lot of people are at more towards the 0 than getting towards the +10. Why would it be important for us as managers to try and move staff, towards that +10? And what would be the advantages for staff and the organisation really if we invest time in that whole area of the thriving,
Yeah, it's a great question, Angela. Thanks for the question. Well, the way we're structured in most organizations now, when somebody is going down from 0 down towards -10, we kick in with an EAP or something like that. And that's terribly important that we have that safety net for people who are really struggling. But what we don't really do a lot of is think about moving people from 0 to +10, as you say. The advantages are, well, a couple of them. One is it's a good thing to do. It's a humane thing to do. There are 3 needs that people have in relation to work. First is autonomy, some degree of autonomy. They need some degree of mastery, so they need training and resources for what they need to do. And they also need kind of relationships, relatability. They need to be able to engage with others. If we provide those kinds of opportunities in the workplace, we have a much happier workforce. Now, people who are happier work better. They engage better, for example, with patients, with clients, with each other. So there's a whole kind of payoff there. But there's another very interesting payoff. We know from amazing research by Barbara Friedrichsen in the States that when you're feeling positive and you're experiencing positive emotions, you actually think differently. Your capacity to process information is enlarged. You're much more aware of a range of inputs. Now, in terms of safety, this is particularly important. And we make decisions differently. It's called the broaden and build theory. So we take in a broader range of information. We use a broader set of skills when we're making these decisions. This is all unconscious, by the way. And by doing that, it's broaden and build. So the next time around, we're in a better position to make that kind of decision. So we're only starting to learn now about how these positive emotions, about experiencing positive emotions, actually has these kinds of effects on decision making. The research evidence is that the organizations that actually practice these sorts of principles, create positive organizations, really do outshine the competition. And that's not just in terms of welfare of staff or climate or culture. It's in terms of bottom line. There's some really good work now in the financial services industry to show, that competitiveness increases, turnover of staff decreases, you're able to attract more people into your organization, you're able to hold on to your talent. So in terms of talent management, it's particularly relevant. And again, as I'm saying, there's a huge body of research out there now showing this.
I think, yeah, because we come across this in open disclosure, even when people kind of the various reactions people have to being involved in a patient safety incident, and we talk about they kind of move on, drop out, or they continue, but they can with their work, but they continue to be affected by something. But we always talk about we aim for thriving, so they can learn from the incident, not work in an environment of blame and shame, and that they can learn, move on from the incident as best they can, and that can sometimes take a long time. But the importance of thriving there is really, really very, very important, you know.
My sense of that would be, I agree with you 100% there. My sense of it would be that it's very, very stressful for somebody who is a health professional to be involved in an incident or an accident, but inevitable. You know, I mean, complex systems, you know, errors are going to happen. It's what happens when that happens. And I think for me, I'm very interested in the idea that's emerging now again called post-traumatic growth. You know, that sometimes when somebody sees involved in or sees or experiences a traumatic situation, we used to always think that that was inevitably lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. But now we're seeing that maybe 30-40% of people, that can actually be a catalyst for a complete change in their mindsets. So things that they didn't think were important suddenly become important. Things they thought were important are less important. And a lot of people will talk about growth starting to happen for them after a traumatic situation or a traumatic incident. So again, there are things we can do, I think, to reframe. A lot of this is about reframing experience. There are things we can do to reframe how we see these kinds of events.
Just Sam came back just about the safety 1 and safety 2, saying that safety 1 focuses on learning from what goes wrong, whereas safety 2 focuses on what we do right.
Okay,
so I think there is a nice to
no,
your
I get
to your
that.
presentation today.
I get that. I've always wondered about, you know, the consultancy industry. You know, the whole thing is based on the idea of coming into organizations and looking at what's going wrong, you know, which is kind of safety 1. It's important. I'm not saying it's not important, but you know, when do you get consultancy organizations coming in and saying what are all the things that they're doing well here, what's going well here, what are they doing right, you know, because the whole business model there is we'll tell you what's wrong and we'll charge you a whole lot of money to help you fix it. I mean, in a nutshell, I'm being fairly blunt there, but that is basically what's going on there. Whereas if I come in and tell you all the things that are going right, there's less business opportunity for me there, you know, because what I'd be doing is telling you all the other ways that you could be using these drivers of good performance to do more of that, but you could work that out yourself.
Yeah.
I'm getting cynical in my old age.
And Ciaran, just a question there as well. Would you comment on toxic positivity, please?
Oh yeah, that's it.
Excellent presentation, food for the soul. Can we have more, please? So I think we'll be inviting you back, Ciaran, for
well, it'd be a pleasure to come back. That's a great question about toxic positivity. One of the problems about positive psychology when it first started to emerge is that it emerged very strongly in America, and it fitted the kind of more the caricatured version that fitted more into an American kind of culture of individualism. And it took a while for other researchers to start getting involved with that. We would see some of that as kind of bit over the top positivity, the rah-rah positivity. So I think what's very important with positive psychology, what we're saying, it's not happy clappy stuff. It's not that kind of. So if you take PERMA, you know, those are the 5 dimensions that we're talking about in positive psychology, you know. So yeah, positive emotions, fine. That's the toxic, the over positive, the person with no insight, all that kind of. But you know, for each of us, it's positive emotions if we can experience them. It's engagement, it's relationships, it's meaning, and it's accomplishment. That means that you can actually have people who are happy but grumpy. If you see what I mean, you know, they don't have to have these positive emotions. It's great to have them as part of it, but if you had the other 4, you know, you don't have to be happy clapping. The other problem with positive psychology when it emerged first was that it was seen to overly focus just on people who are well, who want to get better, and kind of became, you know, it became seen as a sort of very first world and nice to have and all of that. But in later waves of positive psychology started to say, well, negative experiences are very important, and learning from negative experiences are also very important. So we're as equally concerned about negative experiences as we are about positive experiences. So in some ways, the term positive, you know, is a double-edged sword, because sometimes that turns people off and they say, well, you know, I'm not getting into all this positive claptrap stuff. But if you look at the science underpinning it, it's actually much more sophisticated than that. So if you want to talk about psychological well-being, instead of positive or happiness or those kinds of terms. That's another way of actually talking about subjective well-being, psychological well-being is another way of framing that.
Mm-hmm. And Ciaran, just you were talking about leadership as well. And I've been reading a good bit recently on the vulnerable and compassionate leadership, and really they seem to really getting a lot of attention at the moment. And how would you see that type of leadership fitting into this model of positive psychology?
I think Michael West is probably has done more than anybody else to bring this to the fore, particularly in relation to healthcare. I think his work is wonderful. But I think the real key to it is compassion for others, but compassion for self.
Mm-hmm.
Compassion for others is everybody would sign up to that. That's important. That we know from the research. Actually, there's a fantastic book called Compassionomics, written by two cardiologists, two physicians in the States, one a cardiologist, I think. It's a terrible name for a great book, but they've brought together all of the research on compassion. And the evidence is that not only is compassion good for the person on the receiving end, it's very, very good for the person who's behaving compassionately. And that's not just psychologically good. There are all kinds of biological variables that are operating there. So it's going back to that calm and connect kind of system that we talked about. So being compassionate for others is good for us, and it's good for the person we're being compassionate for. And that's the first thing. But the bit that is often missed in that is self-compassion. And I think we have a particular problem in healthcare around this, that the way we develop and train people, particularly when they're young and undergraduate, early postgraduate, earlier in their careers, we're not really sufficiently training people to develop their self-compassion. And I think we've work to do there. Because for human beings working in highly complex, highly demanding systems, that's always going to be challenging. It's always going to be difficult, always going to be obstacles. Marcus Aurelius, in his book Meditations, he's a great line, I think. He says, the obstacle becomes the way. It's not that the obstacle is in the way. If you come at the obstacle in a particular way, the obstacle itself is the way forward. That's the key idea. It's a growth mindset sort of notion. But I think linked to that must be the idea of compassion for oneself. We judge, we often judge others on their actions and ourselves on our intentions, but sometimes we don't judge ourselves enough on our intentions. If our intentions are to be compassionate, we might make a hash of it, we mightn't communicate very well, but if our intentions are to be compassionate, that's incredible. The researcher Neff, whose first name I forget, Carla Neff is it, who's written a great deal about self-compassion, highly relevant for health professionals. And the Buddha says, if you want to be happy, be compassionate. That's core to the human nature.
So, Ciaran, listen, thank you so much. I think we're coming up towards the end of the time for the webinar, and we could listen to you and talk to you all day. And there's lots of comments in the chat, just to say that, and I'll just read out some of them to you. One of the best presentations I've engaged with in ages. Loved every minute of it. Wow, so much and too much to absorb. A few. Just going down to some of them here. Really enjoyed the presentation content. Looking forward to reviewing this again. Yeah, I think we all need to go back and replay this presentation and just go through it slide by slide, listen to it, because there's so much in it and so many great, I think, links and resources in it. And certainly the DIA strengths is something that we could do with our teams, I think, and I'd be very interested in doing that with our own team here as well going forward, around our performance achievement and things for the team going. That's really great. So very insightful and hopeful presentation, which I think is lovely to see the word hopeful there too. And just loads of thank yous to you, Ciaran. So really, I think a very worthwhile webinar. I think it's very good timing around this webinar as well, in the context of where we're at post-COVID and the amount of burnout that we're seeing across the system and the work that we do, and indeed that people are experiencing on the front line. And so just say a huge thank you to you. And just in relation to, just to finish up the webinar then today, so Just a reminder again to everybody that open disclosure learning is mandatory for all staff, and for the majority of staff that will be e-learning module 1 on HSE land, and for staff who have to engage in high level open disclosure meetings, they also need to complete module 2 and then attend a face-to-face program. So you can attend face-to-face by contacting the lead for your area, and the names of the leads for all of the hospital groups, community areas is on our website, hse.ie/open disclosure. So you'll get all the details on there. So do try and recommend this training and push this training across your services. And we are always asked by the HSE, the National Steering Committee, the board of the HSE to provide training data to them, and so it is very important that we do get our staff to engage in that going forward. So thank you for that. And just to talk about then, Catherine, our next webinar. So we have next month on the 12th of April at 11 AM, we've got Mr. Aston Sheikh, who's a barrister at law and assistant professor in legal medicine in the UCD School of Medicine. And he's going to be looking at the medical legal aspects of record keeping and documentation. And he's going to do a particular slant around incidents and claims. And we're also going to be talking about how to document open disclosure and give you some examples of that, and look at some of the documentation templates that are out there to help you. So really a fantastic webinar coming up next month as well. And we are also trying to bring a webinar together on restorative practice as well, which we hope to bring maybe in June or July this year. So watch out for information around that as well. We will as well be bringing some information on the patient safety bill. And that is moving now through the Shannon at the moment, and we could have a final bill very soon, maybe in the next couple of months. So we do hope to do a webinar on the content of the final patient safety bill, and that possibly could be a May webinar. So just again, watch this space. So just to thank you all for joining us today. I think you all enjoyed it and looking at the chat, and do join us on our next webinar. And meantime, stay safe, and we look forward to catching up with you next month. Bye-bye, everybody. So Sandra, we might just move into practice session, if that's okay.